All right, friends. So in the last video, we saw this chart to tell us how we summarize or how we tell the most important parts of the story again. And we said that while we read, we need to gather important information. While we need to pause and ask when we're thinking about what information we need to summarize, is this important enough to include in the summary? I don't know. So let's practice together figuring out what's important when we summarize. Anytime that you read a story, in order to summarize, you want to find what are those most important events. But you only want to talk about the ones that are important. It's good to find things that are interesting, but this is not what we are going to use to summarize. So when you find what's important, you're looking for your story elements. Those are things like the characters, like the setting, the conflict, or the resolution. Any detail that tells you about the characters, setting, conflict, or resolution is going to be important, and you want to use that to summarize. Also, anything else that supports the main idea, which is what we practiced all week. We know that all about our supporting details that tell us about the main idea. So your story elements and your main idea are going to be your important details from the text that you want to include in your summary. However, there might be other details in the text that are interesting, like your descriptions. In the text, it was described that Jackson Pollock wore his boots to paint with. This is interesting because it tells the reader what he wore when he was painting, but do we need that information to understand the story? No. It's interesting, but not important. So you don't need descriptions when you summarize. You also might be excited when you make a connection or learn something new. For many of us, this was the first time learning about Jackson Pollock. So however, you don't need to include that in your summary because even though it's something new for you, it's not important enough for someone else to know that. Somebody else might already know about Jackson Pollock, but we don't need to know that this is new information for you in order for you to summarize. You also might be making a connection with the text. So you might think, I'm a painter too. I paint with Ms. Villa. But this is not going to help us tell the story again. So we don't want information that's interesting when we summarize. We just want information that tells us about our characters, setting, conflict, and resolution, and things that tell us about the main idea. So now we're going to practice figuring out what's important and what's just interesting by looking at these illustrations from the text. Here we have an illustration of Jackson Pollock looking at the gulls on the beach. Here we have one of his paintings. We know that this is an example of how he flung that paint onto the canvas in his own way. Here's another illustration of him looking down at his painting when he's done. Here's an illustration of him and his wife hanging his painting up on the wall. Here's an illustration of him flinging and splattering that paint as he makes his art. And here's another illustration of him being part of the painting, of him using his hands and letting that bug be on the canvas and letting that penny that falls out of his pocket be part of the painting. Now, you might be thinking, well, which one of these are important and which one of these are just interesting if we were to summarize? I'm going to drag and drop these to get to my chart to show you examples of what's something that is just important and what is something that is just interesting. And if I forget, we can look back at this chart to check our thinking. So let's start with this first illustration here of Jackson on the beach. Is it important that he is watching the gulls on the beach? Does that tell me about the character, setting, conflict, or resolution? Maybe a little bit. It tells me about Jackson Pollock, but is it the most important thing that he does? Is this a story about how he sits on the beach? No. So we're going to move it to something interesting. This tells us how he gets his ideas because this is when he was watching the goals and he was thinking about the movement. However, he doesn't always watch the goals. This is not something he does every time to paint. It's just a description. So it's only something that's interesting. We can tell the story about Action Jackson without having to talk about how he went on the beach for it to make sense. That's why it's not important, it's just interesting, which means later when we summarize, we don't need to talk about this. How about this illustration here of his painting? This was one of his most famous paintings, and it helps us learn about the main idea, which is that Jackson Pollock had his own style of painting. And this illustration helps us to see what that was. It tells us about the main idea. The whole time that we're reading this book, he is making this painting that we finally see toward the end. And if so much time is spent talking about this painting, I know that that's going to be part of the main idea or something that's really important to the story. So I'm going to put it to my important side. Now, what about Jackson looking down when he's done at his painting? If I'm going to summarize or tell the story again, does people need to know that he looks down when he's done? No, that doesn't tell me how he paints or why he paints. It just tells me, it's a description. It tells me what he does when he's done, which is interesting, but it's not important. So I'm going to put this illustration down in my interesting side. In these next two illustrations, they have something in common. We see in both of them, they show us how Jackson is painting. We already have on the important side an example of his paintings, and both of these show me how. This one shows me how he lets the penny and the insect be part of his painting and how he even uses his hands. This is different than what other artists do. This is something that the author wants us to know about Jackson. It's a detail that helps us learn about the main idea because it tells us how he paints. So I'm going to put this here in important. I'm also going to put this next painting of him flinging the paint from his stick because I know this is also a supporting detail that tells me how Jackson Pollock paints. So now I have these three on the important side. I know that if I'm going to summarize or tell what's most important about this story, I should say something about how he becomes part of the painting, how his paintings were like nothing anyone had ever seen before, and how he let the paint move and have a life of its own. I don't need to talk about how he went to the beach. I don't need to talk about that he looked down when he was done. And I also don't really need to talk about that him and his wife hung up the paintings in the studio. That's interesting, and that's something that I can make a connection with because I hang up art in my house. But that's not something that's most important to the story. So I'm going to leave it on the interesting side. And now it's going to be so much easier to summarize because I already know that these are interesting. Do we use details that are interesting? No. I only use the details that are important. So I know that these three need to be part of my summary. So now looking at our chart and knowing what details, some examples of what's important and what's just interesting, we are now going to practice summarizing by using somebody, wanted, but, so, then. Say it with me. You're going to say these words here at the top in the different colors. Somebody, wanted, but, so, then. Those 5 words are going to help us summarize every time we read a story. We want to know somebody, who is the main character? What did that main character want? What was the conflict or problem that they faced? What events happened as they tried to fix that conflict? And then what was the resolution at the end? We're going to practice talking about somebody, wanted, but, so, then with our story, Action Jackson.